a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times, and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Mel Gibson just said something that has people questioning everything. Not about Hollywood, not about films, but about the Bible itself. He pointed to a version of Scripture most people have never even heard of, a Bible that was never edited, never reduced, and never rewritten to fit the mainstream narrative. And according to what's being claimed, it may reveal the real story of the end times. Not the one you grew up hearing, not the one preached in churches, but something far more unsettling and far more detailed. Because this ancient text contains books that were removed from other versions, books that speak of hidden prophecies, divine beings, and a timeline that feels disturbingly close to our present reality. So the question is, what did Mel Gibson actually discover? And why are people calling it more shocking than expected? Stay with me. Because what you're about to hear might completely change the way you see the end of the world, the Bible most people have never seen.
You're in another place. You're in another realm. You know, you need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol.
When Mel Gibson started talking publicly about the Ethiopian Bible, most people assumed it was a celebrity drifting into fringe territory. But scholars who actually study these texts had a different reaction. They weren't surprised. They were relieved someone was finally paying attention. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. The Bible most of the Western world considers complete 66 books, fixed and final, is not the only version that survived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a Bible with more than 80 books. That's not a minor variation. That's a fundamentally different scriptural universe. Among those extra texts are writings that were once widely circulated in the earliest Christian communities before they vanished from Western tradition. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, the Diskalia. Not fringe documents, not myths, ancient writings that thousands of early Christians treated as sacred until powerful men in Rome decided they were too dangerous to keep. Ethiopia kept them anyway. For nearly 2,000 years, Ethiopian monks copied these texts by hand in remote monasteries, perched on cliffs and hidden in highland forests. Generation after generation, they weren't doing it as rebellion. They believed these writings were urgent, messages intended not for their age, but for a generation far in the future. And get this, many of those texts are written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language that only a tiny number of scholars in the world can read today. For centuries, the wider world didn't know what these manuscripts actually said. The language barrier alone kept the contents invisible to Western eyes. That invisibility may have been exactly what saved them. If you want to know what those hidden texts say about the world right now, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. What we're about to get into about the 4 stages and the suppressed prophecies has been locked away for nearly 17 centuries. You're going to want to be here for it. How Ethiopia became the guardian of truth.
And I'm not wholly sure I can pull it off, to tell you the truth. It's really super ambitious. But I'll take a crack at it.
To understand why Ethiopia alone safeguarded these texts, you must understand what makes this nation unlike any other civilization on earth. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 4th century, roughly when it was spreading across the Roman Empire, but unlike the Church in Rome, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed in remarkable isolation. It was never absorbed into the religious and political systems of Rome. It preserved its own calendar, its own customs, its own version of the Scriptures. And when the Council of Nika assembled in 325 A to decide which books would shape Christianity for the next 2,000 years, Ethiopia was following a completely different direction. Here's what few people are openly saying. That council wasn't simply a theological meeting. Ethiopian scholars and theologians claim it was a political move. Church leaders connected with Roman imperial power selected text that reinforced a centralized, institution-dependent form of faith. Writings suggesting ordinary people, especially the poor and marginalized, could receive divine truth directly. Dangerous. Writings predicting corruption spreading within the church itself. Even more dangerous. So those writings were removed, silently. Officially, the world was told the canon was finished. Ethiopia never accepted that, and because Ethiopia was never colonized, one of the few nations on the African continent to resist complete European control, its ancient traditions were never forcibly replaced. Its monasteries endured, its language endured, its scriptures endured. By the 6th century, the explorer Erasmus Indicopes was describing a Christian kingdom where faith was woven into daily life and where rulers welcomed Christians escaping persecution elsewhere. They offered safety, they offered refuge, they offered freedom without submitting to Rome. And think about this. When you are not tied to the power structures of the empire, you don't need to filter your sacred texts according to what the empire considers convenient. You preserve what you believe is true, every part of it. Here's the twist. For most of history, no one in the West was paying attention. Ethiopia's ancient Bible rested in highland monasteries, guarded by monks who knew exactly what they were preserving. It wasn't until the modern era that researchers began to seriously examine these texts and realize what had been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. But what those texts actually reveal about the final age of humanity, that's the part that leaves people speechless. What the Ethiopian Bible reveals about the end times. Now we reach the section that has researchers, theologians, and filmmakers like Mel Gibson watching very closely. Because the Ethiopian Bible's account of the end times is nothing like the version many Western Christians have been taught. In the Western tradition, end times prophecy is dramatic, external, wars, plagues, cosmic catastrophes, the rise of a single Antichrist figure, fire from the sky. The book of Revelation presents the end as a series of overwhelming external judgments. The Ethiopian texts portray something different, something quieter, something that strikes much closer to home. According to the Book of the Covenant, one of the most important Ethiopian texts outside the Western canon, Jesus spent 40 days after his resurrection speaking with his disciples. During those 40 days, he explained what the final age of humanity would actually look like. And what he described was not mainly a chain of disasters. It was a chain of spiritual conditions. He described an age when people would know his name, repeat his teachings, and construct magnificent churches in his honor, but would have completely lost the living spirit behind his words. The buildings would be full, he said, but the spirit would have grown silent. Here's where it becomes uncomfortable. He described false leaders working not from outside the faith, but inside the very institutions built in his name. These leaders, he warned, would use his message to justify the accumulation of power and wealth. They would speak about heaven while pursuing earthly dominance. When his teachings were used to silence the suffering and protect the powerful, he said it was a sign that humanity was approaching a dangerous threshold. Then he turned to the natural world. Earthquakes, rising waters, strange signs in the sky that would leave even wise people confused. But his explanation was careful. These events were not punishments. They were signals, like the first contractions before a birth. The earth itself would respond to what was coming, and then came a warning that makes modern readers go pale. He said the thing to fear was not the shaking of the ground. The thing to fear was the moment when human hearts grow so cold that nothing moves them anymore. He called it the Great Silence, and what the Ethiopian texts say happens during that silence. That's what we're getting into next. The 4 stages of the final age. When Mel Gibson spoke about the Ethiopian Bible, this is the section researchers believe left him shaken, because among the most striking passages in the entire collection is a framework Jesus uses to describe the final age in 4 distinct stages. Scholars who have examined these manuscripts say this framework has no parallel anywhere in the Western biblical canon. It begins slowly, almost invisibly. The first stage is called the Age of Forgetting. This is when humanity gradually stops seeking truth, not through dramatic rejection, but through slow drifting. People stop asking the deep questions. They stop sitting with silence. Truth becomes inconvenient, and inconvenience becomes a reason not to search. No explosion, no announcement, just a quiet fading. The second stage is the age of spectacle. This is the part that keeps researchers awake. Noise and entertainment replace wisdom. The capacity for deep thought is drowned in constant stimulation. People become experts at being distracted and strangers to stillness. The texts describe this not just as a cultural failure, but as a spiritual emergency, a civilization losing its ability to hear anything quieter than the loudest voice in the room. Sound familiar? The third stage is the age of the false shepherd. Here the texts become uncomfortably specific. Corrupt leaders take the name of God and use it as a weapon. These false shepherds don't come from outside the faith. They rise from within it. They speak the language of the sacred while chasing the rewards of the secular. Jesus describes them as the most dangerous figures in the entire prophecy because they are the hardest to recognize. And then comes the fourth stage, the one that makes scholars go pale. It is called the Great Silence. Not a silence of peace, not the quiet of a holy space. The Great Silence is described as the moment when the connection between heaven and earth grows so thin that even those who are genuinely searching can barely feel it. The texts say this is the most dangerous moment in all of human history, not because God is absent, but because humanity has drifted so far that it can no longer feel the presence that was always there. But here's what the texts say happens next, and it is the last thing anyone expects. The 7 seals of the heart. If you've heard of the 7 seals from the book of Revelation, you know them as cosmic, external events, catastrophic judgments unleashed from outside. The Ethiopian texts describe a completely different set of 7 seals, and this is the part Mel Gibson has said changes how you understand everything else. These seals are not about the world. They are about the interior condition of a single human being. According to these ancient writings, the real battle of the final age is not fought in the sky or on a battlefield. It is fought inside every person alive. The first seal is the seal of comfort, when a person avoids truth simply because it feels uncomfortable. Growth requires disruption. This seal chooses safety over inquiry. The second is the seal of pride, when someone becomes so certain they already understand everything that they stop listening, stop learning, stop reflecting. Pride doesn't always look arrogant. Sometimes it looks like quiet certainty, and the texts say it is one of the most effective barriers to awakening. The third is the seal of fear, a life ruled by the need for security. When fear controls every decision, people become willing to ignore truth just to feel safe. And get this, the texts say this seal becomes especially powerful in the final age precisely because the world feels unstable. The fourth is the seal of distraction. People fill every quiet moment with noise, entertainment, constant activity, leaving no space to think deeply or hear a higher calling. No silence, no stillness, no room for anything inconvenient to arrive. The fifth is the seal of false community. When people surround themselves only with those who agree with them, an echo chamber where real truth can no longer enter. The texts describe this as uniquely dangerous in the final age, a time when it becomes easier than ever to find a tribe that confirms whatever you already believe. The sixth is the seal of false mercy, where forgiveness becomes an excuse to never grow or change. Comfort masquerades as grace, avoiding accountability masquerades as compassion. And the seventh seal, the one the texts call the most dangerous of all, is the seal of religion itself, when sacred words, rituals, and traditions become a mask hiding a lifeless faith. When the performance of belief replaces the reality of it, here's what the text says happens. When a person breaks through all 7, they don't receive a sign from the heavens. They don't unlock a supernatural gift. They themselves become the spark of awakening the world has been waiting for. But how that awakening connects to the prophecy about the final empire, that's where things get truly unsettling. The final empire and the cage nobody sees. There is another Ethiopian text outside the Western canon called the Discalia, and this is the part Mel Gibson has described as the most difficult to sit with. It records Jesus warning his followers about what he calls the final empire. Not a nation, not a military power, a system, a structure so vast and so subtle that most people would live inside it their entire lives without ever realizing they were captive. He says this empire will not use chains. It will be comfortable. It will give people bread and entertainment and call that freedom. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. This was written down roughly 2,000 years ago, and yet it reads like a description of the present moment with surgical precision. People are not oppressed in ways they can easily identify. They are managed, distracted, given endless options that all lead to the same place. And get this, the illusion of choice the text suggests is the most effective form of control ever devised. Then comes a line that is quietly echoed through centuries of Ethiopian scholarship. Blessed are those who see the cage and still choose love. Blessed are those who are hungry for truth in the age of false abundance. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jesus says that in the last age his voice will rise again from unexpected places, from deserts, from prisons, from the children of the forgotten. He says his Spirit will speak through those who were ignored by the powerful, not through the institutions, not through the cathedrals, through the ones the powerful dismiss entirely. And then comes the line that Ethiopian scholars say was one of the primary reasons this text was suppressed at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The most dangerous truth of the end times is this: the people who claim to be ready will be the last ones who see it coming. The question the Ethiopian monks were sitting with for 2,000 years was not whether this empire would come. They believed it already had. The question was whether there would be anyone left who could see it and still choose differently. That answer arrives in the prophecy they guarded most carefully of all, the prophecy of the final witness. This is the chapter Mel Gibson comments pointed toward most directly, and it is the one Ethiopian scholars say was most deliberately suppressed. According to the oldest manuscripts preserved in Ethiopian monasteries, before Jesus ascended, he gave his disciples something the Western Church left out entirely: a final prophecy, a complete and specific vision of the world in its last days. Ethiopian scholars refer to it as the prophecy of the final witness. And what it names as the final witness is not what anyone expected. Not an angel, not a cosmic event, not a supernatural sign visible to all. The final witness, Jesus tells his disciples, is a generation, ordinary people who will rise up in the deepest darkness of the last days and refuse to be silent. He tells his disciples, this generation will not be welcomed by the powerful. They will be mocked, silenced, and erased from the platforms and pulpits of their age, but their voices will be heard where it counts. Not in arenas or on screens, in the hearts of the people who are ready to hear them. And do not fear if they turn off your awe. Truth does not need a microphone. Here's the catch. Ethiopian theologians argue that the suppression of this prophecy at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was not accidental. It was deliberate. A prophecy that said the most dangerous false prophets of the end times would wear crosses and build cathedrals was far too threatening for a church that was in the process of building its own cathedrals and accumulating its own power. So those words were buried, and quiet monks in Ethiopian highland monasteries kept copying them by lamplight, generation after generation, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to hear what had been taken away. That moment, according to many who have studied these texts closely, may already be here. Why does this matter now? Mel Gibson is not a theologian. He is not a historian. But he spent years immersed in early Christianity while making The Passion of the Christ, and what he encountered in the Ethiopian tradition clearly left a mark. When he started speaking publicly about the Ethiopian Bible's description of the end times, the reaction wasn't laughter. There was a wide surge of people asking, why haven't we heard this before? The answer is not mysterious. It is deliberate. Ephraim Isaac, one of the foremost scholars of Ethiopian religious texts and a translator of the Book of Enoch, has described these writings as containing a prophetic consciousness unlike anything in the Western canon. He and other Ethiopian scholars point to the interior framing of the end times as the defining difference. This is not a prophecy about external events happening to passive people. It is a prophecy about a spiritual condition unfolding inside every human heart, individually and collectively, all at once. And get this, that distinction changes everything. If the end times are primarily an external catastrophe, you wait, you watch, you survive, or you don't. But if the end times are mainly a spiritual condition, something that unfolds inside communities, inside institutions, inside individuals, then every person watching this is already in the middle of it right now, today. The Ethiopian texts describe an age of forgetting, an age of spectacle, an age of false shepherds, and a great silence. Read that list slowly, then look around. These aren't vague prophecies that could apply to any era. They are specific enough that researchers who study them describe a feeling of recognition that is, by most accounts, deeply unsettling. Not unsettling like a horror film, unsettling like understanding something you've been sensing for years but couldn't name. The Ethiopian Bible does not end its prophecy in despair. It ends with a promise that cuts straight through the darkness. Jesus says, "The end is not the end of life, it is the end of the lie." He promises that those who chose love and truth, even when the whole world chose comfort and power, will not be lost. He says they will be known by their scars, not their crowns. For 2,000 years, Ethiopia guarded those words. Monks with ink-stained hands copying ancient Ge'ez letters by lamplight, convinced that one day a generation would come ready to hear what had been preserved for them. Maybe that generation is the one watching right now. If this opens something in you, hit the like button and subscribe. There is far more buried history to explore, and we are just getting started.